Tonight, many of America's farmers already feeling the pinch are worried about the possibility of more challenges.
And we're going to lose another generation of farmers.
There was a time, not too long ago, when American wheat was considered untouchable. It was the staple crop of the global food economy. From Manila to Marseille, from Tijuana to Tokyo, buyers lined up not just for the quality, but for the reliability. American wheat was more than a product, it was a promise. That promise has now been broken. Today, we are not talking about a temporary slump or a seasonal disruption. We are witnessing the slow, silent erosion of trust in one of America's most iconic exports. One after another, countries that once relied on U.S. wheat have begun turning away. Not with speeches, not with protests, but with purchase orders signed in other countries. And before we continue, hit that like button to help us beat the YouTube algorithm and to show your support. The collapse did not come with fanfare. It came through cancellations, unrenewed contracts, empty silos, and in some cases, fields so unsellable that American farmers have been left with no choice but to burn their own crops. This is the quiet crisis in America's heartland, and it is happening now. Let us begin where the shock first landed, in the Philippines. For decades, the Philippines was one of the most loyal customers of American wheat. It consumed around 3 million tons annually, with up to 90% of that coming from the United States. American farmers believed that if there was one market they could always count on, it was Manila. Then, in May of 2025, something changed. 12,000 tons of U.S. wheat were canceled outright by one of the country's top milling firms. No delay, no renegotiation, just gone. Within days, a new contract was signed for 110,000 tons of wheat. Not from Kansas, not from North Dakota, from Canada and Australia. The message was clear. Price was no longer the deciding factor. Stability was. U.S. wheat was cheaper, by $8 to $10 per ton on average. But internal reports from the Philippines told a different story. American wheat was now being viewed as high risk, unpredictable, vulnerable to political disruption. Every ton came with extra costs, delays, insurance premiums, and in some cases, the risk of shipments being canceled outright due to policy disputes in Washington. The dominoes began to fall. U.S. inland ports went quiet. North Dakota, Kansas, Nebraska, 3 of the top wheat-producing states, reported rising inventories. In some Kansas silos, stock levels were up over 40% compared to the previous year. Freight trains waited to load, but never departed. There were no orders. Labor shortages compounded the pain. Immigrant workers, once vital to harvest and transport, vanished due to new restrictions and crackdowns. In fields across Oklahoma and South Dakota, harvests went unfinished. Some farmers, faced with crops they could not sell, lit match to field. And all of this happened while Philippine bakery shelves stayed stocked, just with bread made from Canadian and Australian grain. In Manila, the price of pandesal rose by over 11% in 3 weeks when American supply faltered. When Canadian wheat arrived on schedule, the price stabilized. There was no protest, no celebration, just silence. A quiet victory for someone else. And the Philippines was only the beginning. Across the world, in the culinary capital of Europe, another shift was happening. France, a nation where bread is religion, had long sourced premium hard wheat from the American Midwest. Baguettes, croissants, brioche, all of them were built on consistency. And for decades, that consistency came from U.S. flour. But in 2025, import levels from the United States dropped to their lowest in more than 20 years. Milling companies in Marseille, Rouen, and Le Havre began signing new supply agreements with Canada. Some even went back to domestic wheat, despite a rough growing season plagued by rain. Why? Because American wheat was no longer meeting the new European standards. Shipments were delayed, carbon scores were too high, chemical residue thresholds were exceeded, and more than that, importers no longer knew if the wheat would even make it through customs. One missing certificate, one change in tariff, one new congressional vote, and the shipment could be stranded. The risk was too high. So the buyers stopped placing orders. And just like that, a century-old trade route fell silent. In Kansas, milling co-ops began scaling back operations. Some delayed harvests, others shelved expansion plans. Thousands of tons sat idle, and farmers, many of whom had built their entire business on the French market, started asking if this was the end of the road. Meanwhile, Canada was entering an expansion cycle. Canadian exports to the European Union rose by over 40% compared to 2024. France was leading the charge. Canadian farms were equipped with smart harvesters, automated moisture monitoring, and digitally integrated supply chains. In Saskatchewan, orders could be confirmed within hours. Precise protein content? 12-day delivery windows? No problem. In rural towns across France, American wheat was replaced by flour from Saskatchewan and Manitoba. The transition was smooth. The bread tasted the same. Only the supplier had changed. Across the Pacific, another story was unfolding, this time in South Korea. For nearly 40 years, the United States had been South Korea's top wheat supplier, a quiet but powerful trade bond. American wheat was used in everything from instant noodles to packaged breads. Korean companies like Nongshim, SPC, and Orion relied on it. The relationship was not political, it was practical, until it wasn't. Between late 2024 and mid-2025, U.S. wheat's market share in South Korea collapsed from over 35% to below 17%. In that same window, Canada's share surged to over 60%. The reason? Chemical compliance. South Korea tightened its standards for glyphosate residue. U.S. wheat regularly tested above recommended levels, between 200 and 400 parts per billion. Canadian and Australian wheat stayed between 30 and 70. For Korean importers, that meant a clear choice. One product came with extra insurance fees, testing costs, and potential rejections. The other came clean, pre-certified, and digitally traceable. By June, U.S. wheat was almost gone from Busan and Incheon ports. Canadian shipments arrived like clockwork, and in the boardrooms of Korean food manufacturers, American flour was no longer mentioned. In Washington state, once a key exporter to Korea, inventory surged by 36%. In Idaho, farmers slashed acreage and switched to flaxseed. There were no more long-term contracts, no fanfare, no protests, just silence. Then came the fourth blow, from Mexico. This one hurt differently, because it came from home. Mexico was not just a customer, it was a neighbor, a partner. For decades, it was one of the top 3 buyers of American wheat, over 3 million tons annually. But by mid-2025, that trust was gone. Imports of American wheat fell by nearly 40%. Imports from Canada rose by over 35%, and new players, like Argentina, began entering the mix. Why? Because Mexico got tired of last-minute rule changes. From tariffs to export documents to declaration forms, nothing stayed consistent. One shipment delayed at the Texas border triggered production halts in Sonora. Storage fees piled up, food prices spiked. Canadian wheat, by contrast, was predictable. Clean paperwork, timely arrival, no surprises. And with that, Mexico quietly turned north, not to the United States, but to Canada. By the second quarter of 2025, Canadian wheat exports to Mexico had jumped 37%. In Manitoba, warehouses installed new testing lines tailored to Mexican protocols. In Arizona and Texas, blending plants closed. Farmers slashed prices by 20% just to move inventory. And still, the orders went elsewhere. And then came Italy, the land of pasta, the cathedral of durum wheat. Italy never made a speech, never issued a policy, but it made a choice. Once one of the largest importers of U.S. durum wheat, Italy gradually reduced its contracts. By 2025, Canada held 45% of Italy's wheat import share. The United States, just 15%. Why? Not because the U.S. failed, but because Canada adapted. They built research labs, created new durum varieties with perfect elasticity, integrated inspection with real-time logistics. When an Italian pasta factory orders a shipment, they get what they asked for. Every time. For Italians, that is not just quality, that is respect. So while the US adjusted policy, Canada adjusted protein content. And it worked. From Bologna to Naples, US wheat disappeared, replaced by clean, precise, consistent flour from the Canadian plains. No speeches, no trade wars, just quiet realignment. And that is the story of 2025. Not a collapse, not a revolution, a silent shift, a rearrangement of loyalty. The Philippines, France, South Korea, Mexico, Italy, all longtime customers, all now working with someone else. And they all say the same thing. This is not about price. It is about trust. Canada is not cheaper. Canada is more predictable. And in a world defined by risk, predictability is everything. What happens now? Can the United States rebuild its wheat trade empire? Only if it changes, not just price, but consistency, communication, stability. The world does not want just the best wheat. It wants the most reliable partner. If you found this story informative, do not forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Because what is happening to American wheat today is not just about grain. It is about every export that depends on global trust. And trust, once broken, is not easily restored.